Hello. All right, so this is going to be a off-the-cuff live stream response to an atheist video trying to explain atheistic morality, but more importantly, he responds to Christian kind of theistic morality. And I think he does a good job of like summarizing a lot of objections that I see from atheists um, very often. So I wanted to respond specifically to this video because of that. So with all that said, let's just go ahead and get this started. The video is by you can see his name here, Viced Rhino, and yeah, he's trying to explain where atheist morality comes from. Let's start it.
Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Feels weird doing that after the opening instead of before, but here we are. Anyway, today I'm talking about morality. And yes, this video was inspired by one particular commenter. You know who you are, but no, I'm not going to say who because I know that he loves attention, so I'm not going to give that satisfaction. I'm just going to edge you a little bit. So the question often comes up, where do atheists get their morality from, if not from God? In this video, I will answer that question from a number of different perspectives. But first, let's talk about why people ask that question in the first place. Usually, I see that question asked essentially as a response to anyone pointing out that the God of the Bible is an immoral monster. Well, they say, how can you possibly make moral judgments against God when you don't have a standard of morality yourself? What standard do you propose that we use? Answering this question is what I will do in this video, but first I want to ask you, why do you feel the need to ask that question in the first place? When I say that genocide is immoral, therefore a god who both commits and commands genocide is an immoral god, why is your default response a change of the subject? The source of morality isn't in question here. If we can both agree that genocide is immoral, we should both be able to agree that the perpetrator of a genocide is also immoral without having to distract from the main issue by inquiring about the ultimate source of morality.
Okay, well, the issue is a lot of like the standard view in Christianity, and a lot of most Christians are going to agree with this. We think that given our system of morality, that God has a right to kill anybody he likes, basically. Um, and there's other ways I could approach this. I don't have to approach it from like an assertion kind of way. I could also say, well, how do you know that this morality that we apply to humans also applies to God, right? Because from our perspective, God has a radically different nature. We wouldn't apply human morality to rocks or bullets or tigers or lions, right? Uh, what lions ought to do and what humans ought to do is different. Um, I mean, an easy example is fish, right? Fish don't necessarily need to do the same thing that humans do. Fish ought to live in the water. Human beings ought not. Not that it's immoral for human beings to live in the water, but you get the point. There are different things that creatures ought to do given their nature. And so, considering that God's nature is completely different from human beings, it's not immediately evident why God ought to follow the same moral laws that human beings do, or that he ought to at all. And so, this is why we have to start out with some kind of basis of morality. I think because you need to be able to explain why these morals apply to God in the first place. Um, And secondly, like, okay, so like, let's say that, well, actually, morality is just arbitrary, subjective personal rules, for example, right? You know, my morality, and this is a lot of atheists take this view, not all, not all. A lot of atheists take this view that, well, it just depends on person to person and what they want to do, and or society to society. Okay, well, God transcends all that. God has his own personal feelings. He's not a part of our society. So if that's the way that you're going about, uh, argue about determining what is moral, right? Then again, why think these rules apply to God? Um, and yeah, so that's why we uh, we want to know where your morals come from, because we want to know, how do you know, basically, that God is doing something immoral? So I think that's a fair question. Let's continue.
For issues like that, if we can both agree that it's immoral, it doesn't matter where we get that from. We are in agreement. So, does it follow from the fact that genocide is immoral that a perpetrator of genocide is also immoral, or not? Tossing out the where do you even get your morals from, though question serves as nothing more than a thought stopping technique designed to prevent you from reaching an inevitable conclusion that you don't like. So, if that question is your default response anytime you see someone pointing out your God's moral failings, ask yourself why that is. Why is it that, rather than come to grips with the fact that the God described by the Bible has done things that are unambiguously immoral, you instead choose to deflect from that issue in an attempt to distract from the main topic of the conversation?
Because sorry, because it's important. It's very important to understand what morality is in order to determine whether or not this applies to God. And it's kind of an equivocation to just say, well, it's a, applies to humans, therefore it applies to God. I mean, maybe that's true, but it's gonna be it's something. It's not evidently true just on its face. I think you need to make an argument for that position.
Because to me, it looks like that you're desperate to change topics. It's just not the gotcha question that some people seem to think it is. Anyway, on to the main topic. Where do atheists get their morals from? Well, there are lots of ideas and moral philosophies that answer this question in a myriad of ways, but let's start out with the elephant in the room. The fact of the matter is that most people don't put a lot of thought into their moral system. They go by feeling. This feels wrong, this doesn't feel wrong. The extent of their moral philosophy involves thinking about an action hypothetically before doing the action to see how they feel about it. So, in most cases, the answer to the question, where do your morals come from, is my feelings.
Okay, I mean, yeah, maybe nowadays that's where most people's morals come from. Uh, but that a lot of let me just put it this way: I don't. That's not where my morals come from. Not ultimately, anyway. My morals. I'm a natural law theorist. My morals are ultimately going to come from what is the nature of things, um, and if something is frustrating the natural ends of something, then I think that's bad, and it's just a matter of determining what the natures of things are. So an eye, for example, the nature of an eye is to see. So uh, preventing an eye from fulfilling its natural end of of facilitating sight inside of human beings, I think that's bad, and for that reason. Um, and just to make it more clear that it's not just my feelings like being hidden by some kind of rationale or something, right? I used to be a Protestant, right? A Protestant, non-denominational Protestant who accepted, who I was taught from a young age that contraceptives are fine to use and all that, blah, 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 right? So it's not about my feelings. I saw the arguments for this moral position, and I changed my mind based on those arguments. So I don't. So yes, it's true that a lot of people will be based on their feelings, doing it based on your feelings, and I don't even necessarily think that's a bad thing, because basically the way I see these feelings is, um, maybe some of them are intuitions, but a lot of them are just kind of like culturally instilled values, um, in my opinion. So this would explain why, 100 years ago, everybody would agree that homosexuality is wrong, and today, not quite everybody would agree with it, but some people would agree with it, and I'm sure some people would feel like it's wrong. Some people would feel like it's not wrong today. And I think that's just based on how they were raised, right? And maybe there's some kind of there might also be some kind of evolutionary component there, right? Maybe we evolved to feel disgust towards particular activities that are dangerous for our survival. Blah 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 blah. You get the point, but I don't think so. I think that it's okay to uh, follow your feelings to a degree, because in a it could be an indication of something true. However, I think that we ultimately need to ground that in rationality, and rationality needs to be the kind of over our feelings. It's rationality needs to guide our feelings. So if we can prove rationally that our feelings about some moral issue is wrong, we should default to that rather than to our moral feelings. Um, yeah. So I don't think that my feelings should be the ground for morality, although it's an okay starting point. In other words, uh, yeah. So yeah, I think that basically, I think that generalization you just made there is not 100% correct. It doesn't. I don't think most people who are against contraceptives necessarily just are like, for example, are just like, oh, I hate contraceptives. It just feels wrong to me. I don't know if that's really the case. I think it's more uh, either natural law, the church teaches it, or blah blah, something like that, right? Anyway, let's continue.
And that's independent of religion. Sure, the average Christian will tell you that they get their morals from their religion, but they haven't put any more thought into it than your average atheist, or your average spiritual but not religious person, or any of the other religions. This does not really answer the question, of course, it just pushes it back a step. Where do those moral emotions and feelings come from? That's the real question here. People seem to come with a built in set of moral guidelines that they don't really have to think about, they just operate entirely based on their feelings. So, where do these feelings ultimately come from?
I don't think that's the question. I think that, yeah, okay, a lot of people are going to go based on their feelings, but I think what we should be addressing are the rational systems of morality that we know exist, even if a minority of people hold to those, uh, rational systems. As people who are trying to understand ethics, we need to look at the best explanations for ethics. Um, and I don't think that my feelings said so is the best explanation. I mean, there is a sort of moral sense theory, right? Where there's this idea that, well, we can just kind of sense what morals are. Um, but the reason why I reject that is because I think that we have decent explanation of how we can determine what is moral through reason. That is through a natural law theory of morality. So this moral sense theory is not necessary. In addition to that, it would be sort of evident to. I would feel like it would be evident to most people that what is moral, and yet a lot of people disagree on it. So it doesn't really make sense to me that it would be sort of just something that everybody has a sense of, maybe a priori, or I don't know, some kind of experience. I'm not sure how that would work. Um, but yeah, I don't think that that's the case because there's so much disagreement. It changes with time and culture. Rather, I think that we're going to have to ground it on some kind of uh, deduction, some kind of inference. So, yeah, so long story short, I think that we need to look at the best explanations, and just my feelings isn't the best explanation when we're talking about morality.
Of course, the answer that the apologist is looking for here is God. But I submit that God is a lazy answer to this question that just ends up boiling everything down to divine command theory. Things that God says are good because God said that they are good. So morality ends up being entirely arbitrary, based on nothing more than one being's subjective opinion. And why should we accept God's opinion on morality as being the source of morality? Especially when he seems to have moral opinions that run counter to our own.
Okay, this is okay, maybe some forms of divine command theory would be like that. But this is not how like standard theology presents it. Like God's uh, goodness is not arbitrary. So the way we think about it, so we think that God is the good itself, right? So if you take, so for example, let's say um, we, it's not 100% correct because it's kind of Platonic, but just to kind of get you started, whenever you think about like what a dog is, right? There's going to be like this universal, and this universal is like dogness itself, right? And that applies to all dogs, right? So it's not exactly the same because God is not like a genus of whatever, but God is going to be sort of like that in the sense that he's going to have what it is to be good without limitation, without being limited to a particular thing. He's just going to have all goodness within himself. And so the mode of participation in that goodness is going to be by God causing things to exist. For those who know what I'm talking about there, just throwing that out there. I'm just trying to be somewhat thorough without being too thorough here. Anyway, but yeah, we think God is the good itself, right? And the reason the reason for thinking that several different reasons, but the one I'm going to focus on here is if if we're going to define the good according to, I guess we need to define the good first, right? The good is, according to Aristotle, is going to be what is desirable, right? So that's going to be the definition of good I'm going to be working with here. According to, uh, so given that, we're going to have to ask, okay, so for God, um, what is the good, or what is, yeah, what is the good for God? And if you understand that the good is what is desirable, right? It's going to be whatever is the motive or action for God, basically, right? Because whatever is desirable is going to be a motive for action. So whenever we're talking about God, though, we're talking about something that is uncaused. It doesn't have a final cause, an efficient cause, or anything like that. And it's also, it's ontologically prior to these other things, right? So God is prior to every creature because he's what causes all these creatures to exist. So it makes no sense to say that these creatures are the final cause or the motive for God's action. So, given that, what we have to say is that the motive or final cause of God's action is going to be himself, because nothing outside of himself can be that motive, right? Given that, so what we have here is a reason to believe that God is his own goodness, because God necessarily desires himself. He is his final end, right? and he is his own goodness. So we start with that. Um, from there, um, we can say, okay, given that God is his own goodness, um, and he only acts with the motive of himself, so when he's creating creatures, he's also going to be acting with himself as a motive, since that's going to be his final end, right? And so when he creates creatures, he's doing it for himself. And so their last ends, in some kind of limited way, is also going to be God. And so we have this sort of system where we start with God and we end with God. God's the first cause and the final cause of all things, because it's the motive for himself necessarily, but it's also the motive for him creating other things. And it's the ultimate purpose for these other things existing is himself. In other words, God creates all creatures for himself and out of a love of himself. And this is necessary metaphysically because God is uncaused, right? Okay. So that's the reason for thinking that God is good itself, because he's going to be the good for all creatures in some kind of limited way, of course, because creatures are limited, but also the good for himself. And this is metaphysically necessary because he's going to be the natural end of the of all things, the ultimate final cause, in other words. So let's see. Um, so, but this also provides an objective standard, an objective limitation in a sense. It's not really a limitation when you think about it more deeply, but God is not just arbitrarily acting when he creates things, given this reasoning I just gave. God is acting ultimately with himself as the last end, and God is the good itself. So what happens here, if you think about it, God is necessarily, in every single action that he does, acting with himself, with the good itself in mind. So it's not God just arbitrarily making up rules. It's God acting for the good necessarily. So it's not just God's opinion. God's just not like, well, it's my opinion that this is good and this is good. No. God has no choice in the matter of himself being his last end. That's metaphysically necessary. And he can't create things without himself being that motive or last end. And so there we go. That's why God makes that's why God grounds morality objectively, because of this necessity that he this necessity of the good. There's a necessity there that all creation be directed by their nature towards the good. And this makes sense whenever you think about, again, I talked about this earlier, the eye, for example. Well, what's good for an eye? To fulfill its natural end, right? Um, what's good for a heart? Well, a good heart is a heart that beats and, pumps blood. That's also its natural end. So the good for things is going to be fulfilling its purpose. What's a good argument, right? Good argument is one that fulfills its purpose, which is to suppose provide a convincing reason to believe in a proposition, something along those lines, right? Um, it's going to be its purpose. Yeah. So the purpose of a thing is going to be the good, and that's going to be because of this ultimate metaphysical principle that God, um, you know, God has to create things ultimately for the good in the ultimate sense, right? In the sense that the substances of things, their natures, are directed towards the good as their end, because that's what God creates. He creates the substances of things. Yeah. So yeah, no, the I know that's kind of complicated. It's This is not a simple subject, um, but yeah, the it is not arbitrary God's arbitrary opinion. It's a necessary fact that God acts for the good. That God's creations, God's rules, His the natures that He gives to creatures are an indicator of what is good. They're directed towards the good as their end. And with that, I will continue.
I, for instance, don't think that it's acceptable to completely obliterate a group of people because of something that their ancestors did 400 years previously, as God commanded Saul to do to the Amalekites. But in God's opinion, that was a morally good act. Now, why do my moral intuitions, that are supposed to come from God anyway, have to take a back seat to God's moral intuition?
Okay, I mean, it's not a moral. I don't know if it's really. I mean, I guess you could describe it God's knowledge as an intuition, whatever. But um, I don't think that your moral intuitions necessarily come from God. First of all, because again, they could be influenced by culture. So if you grow up in a culture that tells you that homosexuality is fine, for example, then you're going to start, as we see inside of our culture, you're going to start believing that homosexuality is fine. If you grow up in a culture that says that homosexuality is not fine, then you're going to feel like homosexuality is not fine. So I don't think that your intuitions necessarily are indicative. They can be evidence for the true opinion, but they're not like God's infallible um, you know, word put on your heart. Now, I don't interpret. I know what people are going to cite that verse. I don't interpret that verse that way, nor do the church fathers, in my opinion. Um, but yeah, the reason why is because the reason why God's opinion or actions, which are necessary, the reason why they, with respect to the last end, not with respect to the creation of creatures, the reason why they are, they matter more than your opinion is because they are necessarily for the good, metaphysically necessarily for the good. You are a fallible creature. You don't have to have a correct opinion on what is good. You don't have to will the good necessarily. God does. It's because of the fact that He's uncaused. It follows necessarily that He must do this. But you don't. It's pretty simple. I'm going off the cuff, by the way, so I'm sorry if I'm rambling a little bit.
The obvious answer is because He's God. Duh. Of course God gets to decide morality. But really think about that. Why? There are two possible answers that I see. One is because God created everything and God's in charge of everything, so He gets to decide the rules. But this lands us distressingly close to a might makes right style of morality. God decides because He's more powerful than us, so at the end of the day, we'd better agree with Him about it if we want to not be burned in hell. So if this is the source of morality, then morality ultimately comes from agreeing with whoever has the biggest stick. If that's your opinion, then that's fine, I guess? But you should own up to it. This is not objective morality. It's subjective based on God's subjective opinion. The other answer would be that God, as an all-knowing being, can see all of the potential outcomes of every situation and so will choose the path that has the best moral outcome possible. So, how is this moral outcome calculated? Well, Usually, apologists that choose this route appeal to the immoral and harmful actions that were supposed to be commonplace among the people, and it just got so bad that wiping out the people who were doing the evil acts, things like sacrificing their kids to their gods, was more moral than allowing them to continue to exist.
We need to understand this was not an arbitrary ethnic cleansing, but in fact, this is a specific judgment on a morally degraded people.
God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies.
First, it starts off with incest, and then it goes into adultery, then it goes into offering your children to Molech, homosexual sins, and then bestiality. And we know from Canaanite primary source documents that all of these things were being practiced by the Canaanites.
He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like a mob boss and go, Canaanites, I want them dead, right? He's got reasons for it. And probably the biggest reason, after 400 years of warning, is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their children on the molten hot god Molech, this idol.
The problem here is that this doesn't actually answer the question of why morality comes from God and not from something else. Because in this instance, it's not that God is the source of morality, rather it's that morality is utilitarian in nature. It's about doing the math to see whether any given action will have a net benefit or a net negative once you account for all the consequences of that action. And since God is the only being in existence with perfect knowledge, then only God is capable of performing that calculation in order to determine the times in human history where genocide would actually have been the moral action. But this is not morality from God. This is morality from utilitarianism. God is just really good at the moral math.
This is not correct. And for the reason being that utilitarianism primarily is based on this idea that pleasure is the good itself. There's a couple reasons for believing that pleasure is not the good itself. First of all, there are cases in which you do not, is not desirable to feel pleasure. Like, for example, you don't want to feel pleasure in murdering people. That's not a good thing, right? Murdering people is not something that you ought to feel pleasure in, right? But if pleasure were the good itself, then that would be good because it's pleasurable, right? The second reason is because, well, pleasure is actually sort of, it's something that goes with the good, really. So you have to perform, well, when pleasure is good, right, it's accompanied by some good action, right? Basically, we feel pleasure in fulfilling some kind of desire that we have. For example, eating food, right? It's our natural end. It's good for us. And so there's like this reward for obtaining the good of eating food that is good for us, and that is pleasure. So pleasure is not the good itself, but it's some kind of accompaniment. It's something that accompanies the good. Saying that pleasure is like this thing by itself is kind of like saying that enjoyment of the good is our final end, right? You can't enjoy something unless you're enjoying something, right? There's no enjoyment by itself. In other words, there's no pleasure by itself. There's only enjoyment or pleasure in doing some action or obtaining some good. But yeah, that's not going to be how theists are going to be figuring out what's good, right? We're going to be figuring out what's good by whether it's consistent with the good itself, which is completely different from the way you're doing in utilitarianism. It's going to be based on whether it's consistent with God. And the thing is, it's not even necessarily the greatest good. When God, so if God creates a particular creature that's limited, right, it's going to have some form of the good and it's going to lack some form of the good, right? So it's going to be a limited form of the good. The reason why, so if you think about like the good as a motive, right? Things are going to be more motivating the more good they are. And so creatures are limited goods. They're limited participation in God. And so they're going to be motivating in sort of a limited sense. God himself is going to be the good itself. It's going to be unlimited good with no limits. There's nothing in addition to God to limit him to being this kind of good or that kind of good. He's just the good itself. And so he's going to be desirable, or he's going to be motivating in an unlimited sense. So if we're going to, so we have the scale of just a little bit motivating to perfectly, absolutely the most motivating possible. And that's the good itself. The most motivating possible, obviously, is going to be determining of our actions. In other words, necessarily if you see the good, if you know the good, you can't help but will it. You can't help but choose it. And that's because it's the good itself. It's the maximum of motivating power, basically. But creatures are not going to be perfectly motivating. And so this is the reason why we can choose between finite goods. This is the reason why God can choose between finite goods, and he doesn't have to create the best possible world because these creatures are not perfectly motivating. What's motivating him is himself. And this is also why in heaven we can't sin, because in heaven our wills are perfectly satisfied by God, and it's impossible for us to turn away from God. That all said, yeah, so kind of lost my train of thought there, but the point is that the good itself, yeah, well, actually I lost my point. Yeah, I'll just say the good, it's the reason why we ought to follow God is because he's the good itself, as I said before. And yeah, and God creates particular things. Yeah, this is it. It's not that God calculates things and finds out what the best good is. Not exactly, because when creating the world, he's not motivated by the creatures, right? He's motivated by himself. So he can create these creatures that are finite goods, only have a limited sort of motivating power. And so he's free to create or not to create, which is basically, yeah, that's the conclusion. Because creatures have this limited motivating power because they're limited participations in the good, this is where free will comes from for humans and for God as well. So, but yeah, whenever, but that said, whatever we're talking about, the Canaanites and stuff, it's still true that if God decides to punish the Canaanites, it's going to be for some good end, because the good is what's motivating him. I'm just saying that God doesn't necessarily have to create like the best possible world. He's not calculating it in this kind of utilitarian way. That's my point. And it's also intrinsically theistic, the way that I'm presenting it, because God is the good itself. Pleasure is not good itself. Material things are not the good itself, right? Yeah. So I think that's sufficient to respond to that.
And this is exactly the kind of morality that has apologists appalled at the idea that in extreme hypothetical situations, some people will say that they would be willing to do tremendous harm to individuals in order to do something like save all of humanity. And yet, this philosophy that says that any action where the good consequences outweigh the bad is a moral action is exactly what apologists appeal to in order to justify God's immoral actions in the Bible. They don't, for the most part, despite saying that they do, appeal to God as being the source of morality, so of course his actions are moral. They're moral by definition, no matter what our opinions are. They instead resort to a secular form of morality because, at the end of the day, they don't get their morals from God. They get them from the same place everyone else gets them from. And so they are left feeling uncomfortable with the purported action of what they believe to be the most morally good being possible. Now, there are some who do just say that God said it, so it must be moral, no matter what we think of it. End of story. And although I am appalled that someone would be willing to reject their own morality in order to remain theologically consistent, I at least have to give them credit for that consistency. But most apologists recognize that God's actions in the Bible are pretty well universally agreed to be immoral by pretty much everybody. And so rather than just assert that no, they are in fact perfectly moral, they appeal to secular ethics to soften the blow of realizing that God's actions are immoral.
Yeah, not to repeat myself, but I think he just doesn't understand. Excuse me, he doesn't understand theistic morality, and so he's getting confused. Yeah, he's thinking that we're using secular morality because that's what he's familiar with, right? No, again, it's going to be based on the calculation, if you want to put it that way. Going to be based on God's essence. It's going to be based on the good itself, and it's not going to be based on secular ethics. Anything, secular ethics borrows from Christian ethic or theistic ethics and kind of perverts it and makes it about material, finite things rather than about the good itself. But yeah, I'll end it there. Let's continue with the video, though.
So given these facts, I'm tempted to simply flip the question. Where do Christians get their morals from? It's certainly not God, or they wouldn't feel the need to explain why his actions could be moral while appearing immoral. There would just be no appearance of immorality in the first place if that were the case.
No, that's not true. Because a couple things. First of all, like we are flawed creatures. We have mistaken intuitions, right? And so that's one thing. The other thing is that there is an objective standard of goodness, and it's going to be it's going to have to do with the natural ends of things, right? And so it's not like we're just blindly believing that whatever God does is good. We can look at actions and we can see that those actions are either consistent with the natural ends of things or not. And so there can be a kind of tension there because, God killing creatures is obviously not consistent with their natural ends. It's not, creatures generally want to live, right? So especially human beings, we tend to want to live forever. So it seems to conflict with God's goodness. So what we have to do is we have to point out, well, God has a good reason, right, for killing the Canaanites. And that good reason is not going to be a utilitarian reason, like I said. It's going to have to be something consistent with his nature. And actually, since it's metaphysically necessary that this works out, it's not really something I'm that concerned about, like showing how it works out. Even if my position is, even if we can't, kind of see how it works out, we know based on metaphysics that it necessarily must work out in some way. So let's continue with what he says here.
So, best case scenario for the apologists here, I might not be able to explain where my morals come from, but I know where they do not come from, and they do not come from God or the Bible. Unfortunately for the apologists here, they don't get their best case scenario, because there are actually many ideas that do a good job of explaining where morality comes from. And while this is in the realm of philosophy, where pretty much any idea has its supporters and its detractors, and nothing ever gets conclusively settled, the fact of the matter is that there are a myriad of moral systems that do not rely on the existence of a god in order to work. But as a result of the nature of this discussion, there will be disagreements about this one, even among atheists. It is by no means a settled issue, and plunking God down as the explanation adds nothing to the conversation. In answer to my question of where specifically my morality comes from, I subscribe to a kind of compassionate utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the moral calculation thing that is so hated by apologists, who will then unironically turn around and appeal to utilitarianism in order to vindicate God's biblical actions.
And of course, when someone stood up and said, when would it be right to rape a person? He said, well, if there were a group of aliens that said, we're going to destroy the whole world if you don't rape a person, then that would be morally right. In the debate that I had with him in 2009, I said, okay, could you rape 2 girls? He said, yes. I said, 2,000. He said, yes. I said, 2 million. He said, yes. A lot of the killing in the Old Testament, and some in the New, Ananias and Sapphira you're looking at, was the killing of those who were guilty of crimes worthy of death.
Essentially, utilitarianism breaks down into a kind of cost-benefit analysis. If I take action A, will it result in a net increase in pleasure or a net increase in pain? With pain and pleasure here being oversimplified stand-ins representing a myriad of different aspects of the human experience, anything that people experience as good is categorized as pleasure, and anything bad is categorized as pain, even if it's not pain and pleasure in the most literal sense of the words. And I use the term net pleasure and net pain because there will be situations in which an action will increase one person's pleasure but will cause another person pain. If the pain is greater than the pleasure, then that's a net increase in pain, and vice versa if the pleasure is greater than the pain. So, as a utilitarian, my goal would be to maximize pleasure and minimize pain as much as possible. So an action that increases net pleasure will be categorized as morally good, and one that increases net pain is morally bad.
I already explained a couple issues with pleasure as the good. He does say that he doesn't. I guess he doesn't literally mean pleasure. I don't know what exactly he means then, but in any case, yeah. I don't think that these kind of feelings, for the reasons I gave before, I don't think pleasure is the good itself. Like I said, the easiest one to point out is that you don't want to feel pleasure in murdering people. That's not a good thing. And yeah, so yeah. I also so I will say though, if I were an atheist, I suppose I would probably be something like a utilitarian, most likely, because that's really the best you can do as an atheist. So, I can point to things like, the obvious examples, like you can, under utilitarianism, you can rape 1 million people under certain circumstances. And various issues like that. But I mean, the primary issue I have with it is that, not that it contradicts my intuitions, but that we have evidence that God exists. We have evidence that God is the good itself. And so that's how we should base our morals on, basically. We should base our morals on the good itself. And there's other reasons. I mean, obviously, given that Christianity is true, which I think there's a good reason to believe. You can see my Proving Christianity series. I think that, given that Christianity is true, then you're going to have a bad time if you're going to be disobeying God ultimately, right? You're going to be in hell. And if you obey God, then you're going to be participating in the beatific vision, which will satisfy all your desires. So there's a good reason not to just base everything on pleasure and pain, even if, even if you're an atheist. Or sorry, not if you're an atheist. If you're a theist, if given that there's proof that God exists, etc. So yeah, that's my main objection. But let's see what he says from here on out.
Okay, this is a decent starting point, but it does have some issues. For one, if you'll recall my video from 2 weeks ago, I used a brief clip from Star Trek Insurrection.
Just as cultures have been destroyed in every other forced relocation throughout history.
This is relevant here because if we stick to purely utilitarian morality, we'd be siding with the antagonists of the movie. They only need to move 600 people, and the technological advancements that will be made possible at that point will help billions of people.
We'll be able to use the regenerative properties of this radiation to help billions.
And they're not even killing them. They're just moving them off of a planet that would be rendered uninhabitable by the procedure. Sure, they don't get the immortality that the planet's rings give them while they're there, so it will eventually lead to their deaths. But is improving the lives of billions of people not worth 600 people ceasing to have unnaturally long life and restoring them to their natural life cycles from before they found that planet? This is where the compassionate element of utilitarianism comes in. The fact of the matter is that we don't actually know what would come of leaving those people alone on that planet, and so we cannot accurately perform the calculation to determine cost versus benefit. Maybe, if we leave the people on the planet, they will one day figure out how to reproduce the healing effect of the planet's rings to an even greater degree than was possible when they were planning on moving them. And yes, I know they rejected technology, don't at me. I'm talking hypotheticals and using Star Trek as the jumping off point here. None of this is real anyway. My point is, when talking about something like a genocide or a forced relocation, we cannot know enough of the downstream consequences of that action to say for sure whatever pleasure you hope to increase by taking that action would really outweigh the massive amounts of pain caused by that action. Compassion would tell us that if the net pleasure increases can only be found in a hypothetical future that has a good chance of not even happening, while the action would result in an actual net pain increase right now in the very much non-hypothetical present, then that action should be treated as immoral. Now,
Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know if that's really makes sense. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily true that we, first of all, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily true that we are always going to be in this kind of uncertainty. I mean, let's say, for example, killing off disabled people. We could argue that that would result in a lot less suffering ultimately. And maybe you could say, oh, well, the suffering of the people being killed off, well, what if we could kill them off in a way that doesn't cause their suffering? Like maybe, just kill them all off at once without them knowing it. We then wouldn't we be increasing the, decreasing the suffering? I mean, this is the idea of like eugenics, right? Or just prevent them from reproducing or something like that, right? Well, of course, this is all based on intuitions and such. But this brings to mind another issue that I have with utilitarianism, which is like why, why ought we act in a way that increases the pleasure of all people? I mean, maybe we do happen to do that, and maybe that's what morality is. I mean, I don't think it is, but let's say that it is. Why ought we act that way? And you're going to have to ultimately give subjective reasons, right? It's going to be because I personally desire the good of the majority. And so then based on that desire, you're going to be saying, I ought to do this, right? I ought to act in a way that benefits society as a whole. But what happens whenever we have people who don't feel that way? Like, let's say a psychopath who only cares about their own pleasure and harming others, right? then this system is totally kind of just screwed, right? um, it's not something that you can't exclude. You can't say it's immoral for everybody to act against the you can't say that it's immoral for everybody to act against the utilitarian rule. Whereas for theism, you can say that because it's necessary that God, that everybody has this last end of God, right? And so that makes God the objective good for the reasons I gave earlier. And this is going to be true no matter what moral system, I think, no matter what moral system you bring about here under atheism, right? Because it's always just going to be sort of subjective. You can claim that you could just take like an intuitionist approach and just say, well, it seems to be the case that this is a universal moral law, and therefore we ought to follow it, and it doesn't matter what anybody's opinion is. But practically speaking, I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that people are actually, what good does that do, right? The murderer is still going to murder if he doesn't have the same intuitions that you do, right? So, whereas under theism, you can say, well, no, you objectively ought not murder, and I can provide a motive for them not to murder. I mean, maybe they'll still murder, but at least I can, provide a motive for them not to murder. Namely, you don't want to burn in hell, right? Or you want the good itself is the ultimate answer. So yeah, I think it's going to be. I just don't see why we ought to be necessarily utilitarians. It's going to be depending on person to person. Sort of like how you guys think that whether we ought to be heterosexual or homosexual depends on person to person feelings. It's the same thing. I don't know why you would distinguish between them other than you just don't like the idea of people not following those rules. Anyway, I've rambled enough. Let's continue.
Some actions just inherently cause so much pain and only offer potential hypothetical future increases in pleasure that realistically won't actually be achieved, so it's reasonable to say that such actions will always result in a net increase in pain, and so for all intents and purposes they can be treated as moral absolutes. But now, this leaves the atheist with another problem. God is an all-knowing being. So if we ditch the idea that he just gets to decide on morality because might makes right, we still wind up in a scenario where it's plausible that, using utilitarian ethics, God has properly done all of the moral math and knows exactly what the outcome will be. And so such a being could, hypothetically, command a genocide that actually would result in a net increase in pleasure when looking at the bigger picture. So if I use utilitarianism as my ethical framework, why can't I just accept that God knew the outcome would wind up having a net positive effect? Because of two things. First, God is not just all-knowing, he's also all-powerful. And second, this all-knowing, all-powerful being was the creator of everything. So he could have created everything in a way that would not have led to a scenario in which genocide is preferable to peace. Referring back to my video discussing the question of whether or not God should have just made everyone in heaven, it turns out that there is no conceivable reason why God should not have just made us in heaven while skipping the sinful and fallen earth thing altogether. Apologists tend to agree that there is somehow free will and no evil in heaven, demonstrating that free will does not necessitate evil, and the only reason I've seen given for why we need to go through earth before getting to heaven in the first place is for character development. But God, as the all-powerful creator, could just create us with fully developed character in the first place. And on top of that, this means that every infant who dies before experiencing any character development then winds up in heaven and is robbed of the experience that is supposed to justify the sinful world's existence in the first place.
Okay, so why did God create us on earth rather than heaven? Standard answer is going to be so that we can merit things. It's not wise, at least it's less wise, for God to give us a good that we do not deserve. And so God allowed us to sort of merit a goodness by our actions. And not only that, I would say that merit is a good in itself, right? It's good for us to, it's good for a being to have a good in virtue of himself, right? And you might say, okay, but wait a minute, then God doesn't have that good. But he does, because God is uncaused, right? So he has all the goods that he has in virtue of himself. But us, since we are caused, if God were just to create us with all the goods that we will have in heaven, then we would not have merited anything, because God would just be causing it in us, right? So, in order for us to have merit, which is a good God chose to desire freely, because of that, he created us without some goods so that we could freely choose to merit those goods, right? And yeah, so, and that's logically necessary. God cannot give us merit, because then it wouldn't be due to ourselves, it would be due to God alone. And of course, there is a sense in which everything we have is due to God, but anyway, there's also a sense in which we can merit things. So yeah, yeah, I think that sufficiently answers the question. Yeah, let's continue with the video.
Cameron responded to that idea by suggesting that character development still happens in heaven, but then that renders moot the rest of the argument against just creating people in heaven in the first place. It is just inconceivable to me that a being such as the Christian God could exist, but would for some reason be incapable of creating a world where genocide is never necessary to get a net increase in pleasure. Apologists love to hide behind the idea that God's omnipotence is limited by that which is logically possible, but that doesn't work with the existence of heaven unless you lose your free will upon entering heaven.
Okay, just to be clear, I do want to say that God didn't have to create this world. Like, he could have created any world he wanted to, pretty much, as long as any world he wanted to, as long as it's consistent with the last end, right? So yeah, God could have created us in heaven. He could have created a world without genocide. But there are trade-offs, right? Because you can't, for example, talking about merit, right? You can't have merit without creating creatures that lack some good that they need to gain, right? And so there are some goods that you can't have without evils, and God could have chosen to exclude those goods from creation, and maybe would have preferred that, but it's technically not inconsistent with God's nature, because when God is willing these, when God is allowing evils with the good in mind, so when God's allowing us to lack certain goods, right, for the sake of us obtaining those goods ourselves, that isn't inconsistent with his nature, because the final cause there is still the good itself. The reason why he's doing that is because of the reason why he's allowing the evil is because he is looking at himself and seeing the good and willing that, right? So yeah, it's not inconsistent. It's only inconsistent if you have a misunderstanding of what God is and what God has to will. Specifically, that God has to will the best possible world. God doesn't have to will the best possible world. He's free with respect to creation because creations is a limited good. Yes, let's continue.
Heaven, in which case, what's the point in having free will in the first place? Also, that leaves us with the additional problem that now the laws of logic are external to God, so if he's constrained to the laws of logic, which are now external to him, then that means we don't need to appeal to God in order for these sorts of metaphysical things to exist in the first place. So then by extension, if the laws of logic can exist without God, then why not whatever moral principles you think exist?
Okay. The laws of logic do not exist independently of God, but God is also God has to follow the laws of logic. So here's basically so the laws of logic technically I think are applying to language, right? That's what the logos logic, right? That's what it refers to. So I prefer to call it the principles of being because it's going to be a metaphysical principle. This is I think this is what Aristotle tends to call them principles, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, the what's fundamental here are the principles of being, and here's why I say that. I think the first principle of knowledge is going to be being. Like, that's the first thing we know. We know that things exist, right? And so we know what to, we basically know what, that being is not being. That's how I'll put it. That's one of the first things we know. It's the principle, the being is not non-being, sorry. So like the principle of contradiction. The being is being is not non-being. The being the law of identity, being is not non-being is the principle of contradiction. And this is so it's ultimately going to be coextensive with being, right? Being is going to be the ground or the reason why things act logically, because and this is why it's universal too, right? Because these are rules of being, that being is being and being is not non-being. These are going to be rules that apply to everything that exists. That's why it's universal to everything that exists, because it's a rule of being. It's more than a rule of being. It has to do with what the nature of what being is. So whenever we're talking about God, right? What is God's essence? Well, God's essence is his existence, right? And that's all that it is under divine simplicity. So the reason why these laws apply to God is because it's describing his nature pretty much, right? Because his nature is substantial existence. So it's not that the laws of logic are like this additional thing on top of being of God that kind of limits him. It's that it's his nature, right? His nature is to be himself. It's to be not. His nature is to be not himself, right? It comes from the fact that being is fundamental, existence is fundamental, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I wouldn't think about this as some kind of limitation on God. I would think about it as God's nature, right? And so it's also not something that God arbitrarily creates. So God is actually limited to existence, although it's not technically not a limitation, because existence, there's nothing outside of existence, right? So calling it a limitation is kind of not correct, although it's okay for, it's just a mode of speaking. Anyway, I've talked enough. In a nutshell, no, God cannot arbitrarily change the rules of logic, and logic does not exist independently of God. It's identical to his nature. Let's continue.
At any rate, this does leave us with the question of the ultimate origin of morality. Now, sure, utilitarianism gets us to the ability to objectively measure actions to determine whether they are morally good or bad, but it starts with the idea that increasing pleasure is good and increasing pain is bad. So why is it moral to want to increase pleasure and decrease pain? I could take the lazy route here and just point out that I would personally rather have more pleasure than pain in my life, and either appeal to empathy or self-interest to explain why increasing the pleasure and decreasing pain for others is a good thing. Either I can empathize with them, and so it makes me feel pleasure to bring other people pleasure, or else I could expect that giving pleasure is an act that would likely to be reciprocated at some point, and so me working to maximize pleasure in others provides me with a higher chance of having someone work to maximize my pleasure. You know what I'm talking about. But that's the lazy route, so where does this desire to increase pleasure and minimize pain for other people actually come from? Well, there are a number of potential answers to this question, as with every question so
Just real quick, I do want to point out that, yeah, this would be subjective. As I said before, not everybody necessarily has the same desire to fulfill pleasure. It's not always necessarily the case that, you know, doing pleasurable things for other people is going to be good for you. Sometimes you get more pleasure from hurting others. Like, if, for example, if you're a psychopath, right? So it's not going to be a universal rule of morality, which if you're trying to find some kind of objective morality, that's going to be problematic for you. Let's continue, though.
far. But let's start with an acknowledgement that morality is fluid across cultures and times, and even within subgroups within a single culture. As a perfect example of this, just look at the abortion debate. Millions of people think that abortion at any point in the pregnancy is equivalent to murdering a baby. Millions more think that an abortion at any time in the pregnancy, and for any reason, is a perfectly moral act. And in what I think are probably the largest group, millions of people think that the answer lies somewhere in between these two positions. This is a moral issue. Is abortion the killing of a baby? Is it a person exercising their right to bodily autonomy? Is it a gray area where different situations should be treated differently? For the record, if you are somehow unaware of my stance, it's that the decision should be made entirely between the pregnant person and their healthcare providers. I'll leave a card to a video where I discuss the topic a bit more thoroughly, but for now, the point in bringing it up here is to show that we do not all have the same moral intuitions. There is disagreement about sometimes fairly major moral issues. So no matter where it turns out morality comes from, one thing is certain. There is not some universal set of moral rules that everybody agrees with.
I don't know. I feel like it's kind of like an odd example because whether it's killing a human being is like an objective fact, like, it's well, it depends on how you're going to think about this, because there's different philosophical interpretations. But it's basically whether or not this is a human being, right? Which is a factual question. Human beings are not just like arbitrary things of our will, despite what nominalists would like to tell you, right? There's an objective fact of the matter of whether there's a human being there or not. And usually the abortion debates are not over whether it's okay to murder human beings, which is a moral question, but whether or not there is actually, in fact, a human being there, right? So yeah, I just feel like this is an odd example. But that said, yeah, I mean, obviously, given that God doesn't exist, the morality is going to be subjective, which is, of course, problematic from my point of view. It's the reason why I would say that actually, I mean, it's not really morality. I mean, if your morality is basically that you get to do whatever you want, and you just happen to want something that um, is generally considered good for others. That's not really morality. Morality is not just like you get to do whatever you want, right? Um, so it can tell you what you ought to do in a sense, but it's generally not what people are thinking about when they're thinking about morality. Anyway, let's continue.
Now, sure, apologists will often bring up 3 or 4 of the 10 commandments that most people agree with as an example of universal morals, but they conspicuously leave out the 6 or 7 that have less than universal agreement, like the command against graven images, or to have no other gods before Yahweh. Now, the fact that there are some things that are nearly universally agreed on suggests that there is a reason that we agree on them. So, what is that reason?
Okay, hold on. The fact that people disagree on morals doesn't mean that there is no truth of the matter, right? I mean, I'm sure you're aware there's some people who disagree on whether or not the Earth is, billions of years old. FYI, I do believe it's billions of years old. There's people that disagree on evolution. There's people that disagree on, whether the Earth is flat or not, right? These, just because people disagree doesn't mean that it's not an objective fact of the matter, right? Now, it is an issue, as I mentioned before, for people that hold to a sort of moral sense theory, or that it's sort of self-evident or a priori known what is morally good and not. But for people like me who think that it's a complex question that has to do with inferences, right? I think that it's going to, it's perfectly consistent. It makes perfect sense that people would disagree on this issue, and that doesn't mean there's no objective fact of the matter. Yeah, so let's continue.
I would say that evolution is that reason, and evolution is simultaneously the reason why there is not universal agreement on a lot of the other moral statements. So how's that work? Well, y'all know how natural selection works, right? In a group of animals, the individual with traits that helps it survive long enough to reproduce will have more success at reproducing than those who lack those traits, and so those traits have a higher chance of being passed on to the next generation. Well, selection doesn't exclusively work at the individual level. Sometimes it can happen at the group level. For the purposes of morality, we can look at how humans have grouped together over time, and we can see how human groups today have their own sets of values that they consider to be moral and immoral, and while there is a good deal of overlap between the groups, there is no set that is universal to all people. So if we look at the past humans, we can think about this from a group selection perspective. Different groups can be selected for or against depending on their characteristics. So, for example, if there was ever a group of humans who had no compunction about killing each other on a whim, they would not have had as much reproductive success as a similar nearby group who have an aversion to unprovoked killing. If one group has a hoarding resources for yourself and never share mentality, then when a famine hits, they will suffer more casualties than a group that has a sharing is caring mentality. And so, in a social species like humans, there is an evolutionary advantage to behaving somewhat altruistically so that over time, selection favored the people who did so, both on their individual level and at the group level. But also, this covers why we can't all agree on morality. Different groups of people in different locations and different times would have had slightly different moral strategies that were successful. And just as evolution selects for certain traits over others, it also works through the availability of variation. So no group is going to come out the other end of this process with a perfectly homogenized moral system. There's also the fact that in some circumstances, evolution selects for cheaters. Just look at cuttlefish, for example. Male cuttlefish have 4 pairs of arms, and females have 3. Typically, selection would favor the larger, stronger males. But for some males, they developed a cheating strategy where they will conceal 2 of their arms in order to disguise themselves as a female. Then they will sneakily mate with an actual female while the dominant male of the area is distracted somewhere else. So cheating behavior can create a survival advantage in some cases. So we still wind up with immoral actors in every group, even if the group as a whole sees their behavior as immoral. Tangentially, I think this also explains the development of the belief in an afterlife. It doesn't seem fair that someone who behaves immorally can enrich themselves through that behavior at the expense of others and not face any repercussions for their actions. So the idea that after they die, there is a powerful moral arbiter who will judge them for their actions and punish those who are immoral in life is a very appealing idea. Then comes organized religion, which latched onto this desire to see bad people punished after death, and then used it to institute rules that would benefit the religious leaders, who, in theory, provide moral guidance to the populace, but in practice exert control for their own benefit. To be clear, I don't think that this happened overnight, where one ambitious priest decided to write an entire law book telling everybody to pamper them. It probably happened organically over the course of decades or centuries even, but that was the end result. Actually, I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Okay. I don't necessarily disagree that like our moral intuitions could be influenced by evolution in this way. So I could agree with everything that he said there, as far as the evolution aspect. However, uh, I would not agree that those intuitions are the basis of morality, uh, for the reasons I gave earlier, and I would point to rather an objective source, which is metaphysically necessary, which is God or the good Himself, right? As far as the religious thing, I think it kind of falls apart. Okay, I mean, maybe there could be an evolutionary component to religion as well, sure, or whatever. But um, the the idea that religion is somehow a mechanism of power and priests are just like being pampered. I mean, it sounds like you've never actually, like, no offense, but like you've never actually uh, met a priest or know anything about priests, because like at least within the Catholic tradition, right? They're not like these oh, I forget his name, these prosperity gospel preachers. They're like, well, if you give me more money, then you get healings or something like that, right? They they have a vow of not only poverty but also chastity, virginity, right? If I don't think that people who are seeking power could swear a vow of poverty and virginity. That just makes no sense. And uh, that's part of the reason why um they do it, I think, because yeah, it, it, it's not so that they can get power. They actually believe it. Okay. um and the priesthood has been like this for thousands of years, at least within the Christian tradition. So yeah, I don't think what he said is a good representation. It's kind of disingenuous, right? It- Suggesting that priests actually just have some kind of bad motive or something, or at least, or maybe it was like originally designed that. Well, he said it wasn't originally designed that way. It kind of developed that way to where it is now, but no, that's not how it is now. It's that way in like a few Protestant churches that um didn't exist uh like, I don't know, 500 years ago, right? 500 years ago, I don't know, maybe not exactly 500 years ago, but something like that, right? There was no Protestant Reformation. There wasn't so there weren't these like prosperity gospels. Anyway, I've gone on long enough. uh yeah, so I hope this video helps people to understand more where religious theistic morality is coming from, and how it's a more objective solution than what he's presenting. Um, Thanks for watching. I will end it here.